On August 2, 1990, Iraqi forces invaded Kuwait and seized control of the oil-rich country. A week later, Saddam Hussein, the Iraqi dictator, annexed Kuwait as Iraq's 19th province. Iraq's annexation of Kuwait upset the already volatile geopolitical dynamics of the Middle East. The developing crisis compelled the Arab League to condemn the invasion. Then, tensions rose between Iraq and Saudi Arabia when U.S. military intelligence detected a buildup of Iraqi forces in Kuwait's southern border with Saudi Arabia. At the request of Saudi King Fahd, U.S. President George H.W. Bush promised to defend Saudi Arabia, America's important regional ally. Because by annexing Kuwait, Iraq now held a fifth of the world's oil supply, but bringing Saudi Arabia under its control would allow Saddam to control half of the global oil reserves. By September 1990, Iraq had massed 360,000 troops and 2,800 tanks at the Saudi border. Meanwhile, Jabir III, Kuwait's deposed ruler in exile, appealed to the international community. On August 3, 1990, the UN issued Resolution 660, which condemned the invasion and called on Iraq to withdraw its forces from Kuwait. Continued Iraqi defiance subsequently led to the UN issuing more resolutions, including Resolution 678 in November 1990 that set the date for Iraqi forces to withdraw on or before January 15, 1991, as well as authorizing member states to enforce the withdrawal, using force if necessary. Prompting on these resolutions, UN member states led by the United States assembled a multinational coalition force based in Saudi Arabia. Since Mecca and Medina, Islam's holiest sites, were located in Saudi Arabia, at the urging of King Fahd, the 34-nation coalition included contingents from, apart from Saudi Arabia and Kuwait, other Arab and Muslim countries. Some 960,000 troops were assembled, with U.S. troops accounting for 700,000, while Britain and France also sent sizable contingents. President Bush faced opposition from U.S. Congress to implement Resolution 678. Ultimately, however, U.S. Congress gave the approval for war after news reports of widespread atrocities were being committed by Iraqi occupation forces in Kuwait. Furthermore, Western countries were alarmed by Iraq's programs for producing chemical and biological weapons, which Iraqi forces had used extensively in the Iran-Iraq War. In the next few months, officials from Iraq and the United States met to try and work out a settlement, including Iraq proposing to withdraw its troops from Kuwait in exchange for Israel withdrawing its forces from occupied areas in Palestine, Syria, and southern Lebanon, a proposal rejected by the United States. Last-minute talks on January 9, 1991 also broke down, leading to the imminent outbreak of war. The coalition offensive to recapture Kuwait, codenamed Operation Desert Storm and led by U.S. General Norman Schwarzkopf Jr., was launched on January 17, 1991, with hundreds of coalition aircraft attacking military and vital public infrastructures in Iraq. The plan was to gain full control of the skies over Kuwait and Iraq before launching a ground offensive, particularly since Iraqi forces were deployed close to the Saudi border in entrenched positions fortified with barbed wire, minefields, and armored and artillery nests. U.S. planners deduced that the concentration of Iraqi positions in southern Kuwait meant that Saddam intended to inflict an unacceptably high rate of coalition casualties to turn American public opinion against the war, just as it had in the Vietnam War. However, President Bush stated that the war would not be another Vietnam. Coalition planes targeted Iraqi air bases, command centers, military installations, communications and power stations, weapons complexes, oil refineries, and road and rail infrastructures using technologically advanced equipment and weapons. American B-52 bombers also bombarded frontline enemy positions, which would have a demoralizing effect on Iraqi troops and affect the outcome of the war. With Iraqi radar and communications facilities destroyed, Iraqi warplanes ceased to be a factor in the war. Instead, Iraq turned to using Scud missiles, hitting targets in Israel and Saudi Arabia. By the fourth week of February 1991, coalition planners decided to launch the land campaign since the continuous 37-day bombings had not forced Iraq to withdraw from Kuwait. Furthermore, Iraqi artillery was firing on coalition forward positions, and Iraqi forces in southern Kuwait had even attacked and briefly held the Saudi town of Kafji before coalition units forced them back across the border. Weeks earlier, coalition forces also conducted mock landings along the Kuwaiti coast, which lured Iraqi commanders into believing that a major Allied amphibious operation would be launched for the recapture of Kuwait. Then on February 24, 1991, coalition forces opened an artillery barrage of Iraqi positions in southern Kuwait. Then ground forces in the eastern sector, spearheaded by US Marines and flanked by Arab units, crossed the border into Kuwait. What followed was one of history's most one-sided wars. The continuous air bombings of the previous weeks had so weakened forward Iraqi forces, which consisted of poorly trained, under-resourced conscripts, that whole units readily laid down their weapons and surrendered to the Allies. By late afternoon of February 26, 1991, coalition forces had reached the outskirts of their objective, Kuwait City. However, the eastern sector's rapid advance caused great concern for coalition planners because of the threat of Saddam sending his 8 divisions of the elite Republican Guard to join the battle in Kuwait against the underweight eastern sector. Just days earlier, General Schwarzkopf had moved the bulk of his forces comprising 150,000 troops and 1,600 tanks some 300 miles to the west along the Saudi-Iraqi border, which comprised the western sector. On February 25, 1991, the western sector, spearheaded by US armored divisions and flanked by British armored and French units, crossed the border into Iraq, tasked with confronting and destroying the Republican Guard. Coalition forces initially met only light opposition, as Iraqi planners believed that the flat, featureless expanse of desert was an impenetrable barrier to traverse. However, US forces were equipped with a new navigational method, the GPS. Using GPS, US and British forces advanced 190 miles north and then 70 miles east through Iraq's Al-Muthanna province in a flanking maneuver that became known as the Left Hook. What followed in the next 2 days was a series of some of the greatest tank battles in history, involving thousands of tanks and armored vehicles from both sides. These battles were extremely one-sided, with several hundreds of Iraqi tanks and armored vehicles destroyed, while the technologically superior American and British tanks suffered only minimal losses. With his forces crumbling on all fronts, on February 26, 1991, Saddam ordered a general retreat from Kuwait. During their retreat, Iraqi forces caused considerable destruction to Kuwait City and in a scorched earth campaign blew up hundreds of Kuwaiti oil wells, as well as having earlier released large quantities of Kuwaiti oil into the Persian Gulf, polluting the coastline. On February 27, 1991, coalition forces entered Kuwait City, where they were welcomed as liberators by large crowds of Kuwaiti civilians. At the height of the Iraqi withdrawal, coalition planes and ground forces attacked the fleeing Iraqi soldiers. In the aftermath, some 2,000 vehicles were destroyed, creating a dramatic scene of long stretches of charred, mangled remains of armored vehicles, cars, trucks, and buses along Highway 80 in what became known as the Highway of Death. President Bush, concerned that this seeming massacre could provoke Arab and Muslim members of the coalition, on February 28, 1991, announced the successful liberation of Kuwait and the start of a ceasefire. Some small-scale fighting continued, including one major encounter where a US force waylaid a retreating Iraqi unit, inflicting heavy casualties and extensive destruction. On March 3, 1991, top coalition and Iraqi military officers signed a ceasefire agreement which stipulated the following: a separation of forces, the release of prisoners of war, Iraq providing the location of mines in Kuwait and the Persian Gulf, the withdrawal of coalition forces from Iraqi territory, Iraq ceasing its claims to Kuwait, and Iraq paying war reparations to Kuwait. Some of these provisions had been contained in a UN resolution released 1 day earlier. Another UN resolution also stipulated the following: war reparations against Iraq, establishing a demilitarized zone between Iraq and Kuwait, and requiring Iraq to stop its chemical, biological, and nuclear weapons programs. Pre-war predictions anticipated a titanic struggle that would cause thousands of casualties on both sides, with perhaps coalition deaths up to 30% because of the threat of Iraq using chemical and biological weapons. Instead, the war was extremely one-sided. The U.S. Army's technologically advanced weapons and equipment and new battle doctrines pertinent to them rendered the Iraqi Army's use of static defenses ineffective and obsolete.